As businesses around the world buckle in and brace themselves for the impact that the coronavirus pandemic will have on their operations, proper crisis management has become a necessity for company leadership. Yet only 54% of companies have a crisis plan in place. One of the most important actions that business leaders can take in the event of a global crisis event like COVID-19 is to quickly implement a plan to communicate company-wide updates. That's why Beekeeper prepared a general list of internal communication tips to help you effectively communicate with your team during a crisis situation. Download Beekeeper's free crisis communications checklist today at www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. That's www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. Welcome to the Crisis Averted Podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlotta. In this episode, I speak with Gary Inman, President and Principal Designer of Gary Inman Interior Design. During our conversation, he shares how having diversified revenue streams has helped him with overcoming COVID-19 obstacles and what young designers can do to better protect themselves financially during times of crisis. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Hey, and if you're listening to the Crisis Averted podcast on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating, review, or both. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Gary, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, CJ. Glad to be here.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with you, Gary, mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Certainly, yes. I've been an interior designer for about 27 years now. Prior to that, I was a fashion designer in New York and kind of figured out that fashion design wasn't what I wanted to do long term. And so I moved over into interior design, doing primarily residential work, which I love and I've continued to do. But then about 15 years ago, I started doing hospitality and really started to grow that part of my practice. And then for the past 5 years, I was vice president of hospitality with Baskerville, which is a company that many people in the industry know. It's one of the hospitality giants. Had a great time there, really loved the firm. But I had decided that I really wanted to have a different type of firm and diversify and do residential and also boutique design, boutique hotel design. And I also wanted to do product design. So there were a lot of things that I wanted to do with my practice that are harder to do in a larger firm. So I began to look at growing and changing there. So that's what I'm doing. I've created my own firm again. This is sort of full circle for me. And I'm also a partner with my wife in Grace Purchasing, which is obviously a purchasing company. And we work for hotels and hotel designers and sometimes for residential designers as well.
So Gary, I read in a profile piece in Inspire Design, you mentioned that just like many people, you thought, 2020 was going to be your year, right? So take me back to pre-pandemic Gary in 2020. What was going on in his life?
Yes, pre-pandemic Gary was having a lot of fun. It was going to be a great year. Really, I think it was going to be probably my best year in my career. I had made that sort of decision to transition and have a little bit of a different kind of practice. And one of the things that happened is I interviewed with High Point University, and they had offered me an extraordinary position as their designer in residence, which would mean that I could teach a couple of classes per semester, but then I would also continue to practice and bring that practical experience into the classroom and really be a mentor to their students. And so I was excited about that. And I was planning to relocate down to High Point, North Carolina to assume that position. And I would have started that in August of this year. So it set me up to really be able to do the teaching. I was taking one of my best clients for my whole career, Duke University. I've done their hotels for 17 years now. And so they were excited about my new firm. So they were coming on board. And my purchasing company, Grace Purchasing, was going to do their purchasing. Everything seemed to be falling into place, as it were. I was brand ambassador for Tomlinson Companies, which is this great upholstery company based down in North Carolina. You probably know Vladimir Kagan's gorgeous curvaceous pieces of upholstery. And they were the people that created those in mid-century and still do create those. So I had a lot of really wonderful things going on with my career, and was planning a pretty interesting adventure in Italy. And so it just seemed like the whole year was going to be really a positive one. And then COVID happened. So, and, obviously, like everyone else, I had to rethink all of those plans.
So when the pandemic hit, what did you do to assess your situation? How did you organize your thoughts and plans? How did you prioritize?
It's a great question, and it's obviously not an easy thing to do. I think one of the most interesting comments I heard recently in another conference, a gentleman who was in banking, of all people, he said, I think it's important that we remember that sometimes when you have a plan and you've really invested in that plan, and then for some reason that's beyond your control, that plan is destroyed, you have to allow yourself to mourn for a while. And it struck me as an odd comment, but the more I thought about it, I thought, he's actually right, because I remember going through a couple of weeks where I just felt a bit disoriented, and I thought, okay, this is interesting. Everything I had laid out in this really careful transition from being with Baskerville to teaching and practicing on my own was so carefully thought out. And then, of course, it all disappeared because of COVID, which was beyond my control. So the diagram he had outlined was perfectly there. So what I did is I began to think about this, not so much as pivoting. I really dislike that word. When I looked up the definition of it, because I knew it bothered me, I thought I wanted to really understand that word. And what it essentially means is you're defining a new destination or a new approach to your design practice or any kind of business model, because the market has shifted and those are no longer sellable skills or products. And that's really not what's happened. What we've had is this sort of strange interruption in the way that we do business, but the value that I bring to design projects hasn't changed. And that will still be very valid in the post-pandemic world, which we hope is not so much further away.
Right.
So I began to think of it as restructuring the sequence of things. And that really helped me to come through the sort of darkness of the transition or the pandemic onset, because I thought, okay, well, I'm not really giving up the dream of teaching. I'm not giving up this or that. I'm just simply needing to reorganize it. I thought of it as a chessboard, and I thought I need to move the pieces in a different way than I had planned in my mind, but I can still get to checkmate. I'm just going to have to take a different route to get there. So that really helped me, at least psychologically. And then the pragmatic part of it, I'm a spreadsheet guy. I know my way around Excel. And so I started sitting down and mapping out what was happening with my design practice and what would be happening with Grace purchasing and also with our personal finances, and just sort of looking at, okay, what does the next year look like? This is where we're at. And a lot of the things that I expected to come to fruition are not going to happen. And, we all have to look at it from a financial perspective. And so I did a spreadsheet and I did projections, and I looked at my cost and what I was going to be able to bring in. And I knew that I needed to find some new revenue streams during this time. And I was fortunately very successful and able to do that. I formed a relationship with 60 Grit Studios in LA. They're this extraordinary fabricator that makes pieces for Facebook and Google and youre and Disney and others. And so right away I found an opportunity there. So that was rewarding, but it really came down to planning more than anything else. For me, it was once I had it on paper and I could see, okay, we're going to be okay for this period of time, and I will bring in opportunities during that period of time. So, once I sort of felt like I had some control over it, it may have been, actually artificial control. I may not have had any control, but at least I had a sensibility that I had some control, because I could see an outline for how I'd go from, here to a year later, getting into 2021, when I thought we probably will have the pandemic under control by then. And I think the timeline's probably going to be close to that. It may be a few months off, but so that was kind of my way through it.
I know you're a big believer in diversifying revenue streams. Is there a story behind that? Did you, as a young designer, learn a lesson on the importance of diversification?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So much of what I know as a designer after 27 years has really not been what I learned at FIT or any of the schools that I went to. It's been what I've learned in the world, in the world of hard knocks, as they say. So, early on, I was really so focused on luxury homes, and that was really doing extremely well. When I first started my practice back in 1998, the economy was soaring at the time, and all my clients were really spending money and not really thinking very much about it. And it felt very comfortable. And then that started to shift, and I started to think, well, I think the important thing is to have diversification. And I remembered an old Southern expression that my grandmother had said to me repeatedly, just about life in general, and that is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And, I thought it was a funny thing at the time, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, I don't have any eggs and I don't have a basket. So, I couldn't quite, as a young person, couldn't quite understand the relevance of that. But wow, now do I get it? Because, she was essentially saying, don't just have one thing that's going to sustain you, whether it's, romantically or financially or in life. You always need to have different possibilities. And so I think it was a great lesson. So what I started doing back with my first firm in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, I had that practice for about 11 years before I merged with another company. I started doing things like trying to expand into hospitality, and I was able to do that. I got my first project and then another project. And so that really gave me some diversification in terms of the practice. And I was also writing for one of the local magazines here. I started doing a column called Inside Design, and I wrote for them for a couple of years. I taught a bunch of courses at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, which is a great museum here in Richmond. And so, was teaching, and then I did a couple of tours to England. I worked with a travel team that was putting together these very exclusive tours, and because I had a background in architectural history, they thought I'd be a great person to lead those. So I was always doing a diversity of things. It made my practice it made my life much more interesting, made my career more interesting, of course, but it also gave me different pockets of income coming in. I taught at VCU also as an adjunct professor, so that was something else I was doing. I was teaching some evening courses there in architectural history and art history and so forth. So, I was really almost a year in, I started diversifying. I thought, if I'm going to be successful at this, I have to be getting revenue from more than one source. And so that was kind of the reason that I did it.
Now, I know you work with a lot of young designers. We'll get into mentoring in a bit, but do you find that a lot of the young designers don't understand that diversification aspect?
I do. I have a concern that the design programs throughout the country are really not preparing design students to be completely successful as designers, particularly if they're going to try to have a practice of their own, or they're going into a small firm or small team where having multiple skills is really important, because we get so many design students who have good production skills. That is, they know Revit, they know CAD, they know how to do InDesign. So they can really help in terms of putting a project together and getting it ready to present. But they don't necessarily have presentation skills. They don't necessarily have strong business skills. They don't necessarily have strong marketing skills. And all of those things, designers, to be successful, have to wear many hats. They really do. It's a really multifaceted career. You can't simply be strong in one of those aspects. You have to really be able to have a command of all of them. And I don't feel like that's part of the curriculum now and part of what's really happening. And so I don't blame young designers. I think in some ways we're failing them because we're not giving them those skills before they go out into the design world. So most larger practices know that when they hire a young designer, they're going to need to invest quite a bit of time to really bring them up to a level where they can be beneficial on projects.
Yeah, and just going off of that, you mentioned in a recent Business of Home article that mentoring has always fed your creativity. When did you realize there was that connection? How far along in your career were you?
For me, it came fairly early, and the reason was I had spent about 8 years in grad school preparing myself to teach. I did my master's in art history at VCU School of the Arts, and then I went to University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and I studied architectural history, and I completed everything but my dissertation. So I went all the way through the doctoral program, and I really had intended to teach, and then I just on a whim, decided to do a designer show house because I thought, well, it's going to take me 2 to 3 years to write my dissertation. And I thought I should really have a little bit of income coming in during that time, having been in school for 8 years. And so I sort of did that a bit on a whim, on impulse, and it was very successful. And then suddenly, the practice began to get in the way of the research. And so I didn't finish the dissertation, but all of that had set the stage for me to be a passionate teacher, and mentoring to me is teaching. And so I just sort of naturally had that instinct, and I was still teaching some adjunct courses at Virginia Commonwealth University. And as I mentioned earlier, I was teaching courses at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. So I just had students in my life all the time. And I can always tell when someone's struggling with a concept and they're not really understanding. So I learned very quickly how to make the learning process interesting for them and to do it in a way that encouraged them to explore more. I think there's a kindness and a patience you have to have in order to be a good mentor or a good teacher. And so I cultivated those skills. It was something I kind of had an instinct for it, but the more experience I had with it, the easier it became, and the more I discovered that I really enjoyed it. And that's why I'm now moving towards teaching being an important part of my overall career. So hopefully that will happen soon.
Yeah, and how can designers be better mentors? What have you learned over the years about mentoring, and what works and what doesn't, just from your experience?
Yeah, again, I think patience and being kind. Sometimes I notice more experienced architects and designers are guilty of just wanting to get to the result, and they get frustrated too easily when someone's struggling to understand something that they think is very easy because they've done it hundreds or thousands of times. And I always put myself in the position of the young designer or architect, because I've mentored a lot of architects as well, and they haven't had the advantage of that. This is all new to them. They're learning a new language, and they're learning a new business model and a process. And so I put myself back in, I empathize, in other words, and I put myself into their shoes, and I think, okay, how would I want to be treated? And I would want to be treated with respect and patience, while I try to grasp something. And then once they have it, they typically do have it. The other thing that I've done that I think has been really successful is I don't just tell a young designer, okay, we're going to do this on this project, or that's going to be the design solution. I take the time to explain to them why other design solutions that we may have discussed when we come together as a design team, and do our charrette or whatever, I'll explain why those other choices that we're not going to pursue were less relevant and less productive than the one we are going with. So I take the time to help them understand so they can make that analysis in the future. And they'll go, okay, well, this is really what we should do for these reasons. There's so many things you learn from experience. You make mistakes, you do stupid things. It costs you money, it costs you time and frustration. And then you don't make those mistakes again. And that's the reason I think the paradigm works well when there is an experienced designer or architect guiding a young professional, because they bring all that experience to the table. But if we don't take the time to explain what we've learned and how we learned it, sometimes I think sharing a mistake can be very powerful. I did that last night. I was a part of a panel on what's happening with furniture design now and the sort of overlap between residential and hospitality. And one of the professors who was on this panel with me mentioned crocking, and I could tell that the audience wasn't really grasping the importance of that. So I said, can I just share a story? And I told them about a resort project that I did where I created these beautiful chairs and put them into this dining room, very luxurious, property. And they were a cream faux leather from Kravet, beautiful embroidery fabric on the back of the chair. And then guys started coming in who had been playing golf, and they had on navy shorts, and some of them had on jeans, and they were hot. They were, in some cases, damp because they had been playing golf and had been sweating. And the combination of heat, pressure, and dye crocked. And so when they would get out of these chairs and leave the dining room, there would be these blue impressions of their backsides on the chairs. And that's when I learned what crocking was. And when I tell that story to young designers, they're like, oh my God, what did you do? And I was like, well, we had to have the seats reupholstered, and it was very expensive. And, after that, I was so careful about writing specifications and knowing that the product I was choosing would not have that same performance issue. And, it was really interesting to see the audience go, oh my God, that's a great example. And, I think people are looking for arbitrary, dull, sometimes boring things to be made relevant and to make them a little bit more interesting. And when they realize that, a code is there to protect you from those kinds of mistakes, and then I think they take it more, they take it with greater veracity. So
I want to circle back on you being a panelist in a second, but is there anything you look for in a mentee?
I look for someone who is open and really has a passion for the industry, and they want to learn, and I can see a spark in them. I can tell that they're going to be successful because they are open, and they realize that they've got some basic skill sets, but they've got a lot to learn. And they're open to that, and they're excited about it, and that's what they want. They want the experience. They're willing to put in the work and really and gain that experience over time. There's no way to do it any other way than simply to get in there, roll up your sleeves, and work on projects. And you just learn so much from that. You can't get that from any kind of computer program, and you can't get it from Instagram. Some young designers think they can just design from Instagram or Pinterest, and it doesn't work. You really do have to know why things work together, why things don't work together. You have to know how to create a narrative and a story and an experience for the hotel guest. And you really can't do that by mimicking something that you've saved on an Instagram from an Instagram post. It's a lot more profound than that. And so I look for the young interview. When I'm in an interview, I'm looking for that young person that I can tell has that humility. I think it's a kind of humility. They're excited, they're passionate, but they recognize they don't know everything. And I want to be a part of your firm because I want an opportunity to learn and contribute. That's really it for me. That sells me. If they say that in their own words, then I'm like, okay, this is a person who's going to be good. If someone comes in and they're too arrogant and too self-assured for their level of experience, I find that to be a turnoff because I think, well, they're going to be resistant to inputs. They're not really going to want to absorb the information. It's going to make it much harder to get them to a place where they're really beneficial to the firm. So usually those are the students that I would pass on.
And you speak on a lot of panels, of course. Is there something you try to convey when you're on those panels? Some overall message?
Yes, I've been on so many, and I've been fortunate to moderate a bunch of them as well. And I've tended to structure my panels at BD&Y, for example. I've done one on luxury and talking about what luxury is, and I like helping people to understand a throwaway word, that we all hear like all the time. Well, what does that actually mean? And so I had great panelists, and so we dug into that and really talked about it in greater detail. And then I did one on experiential design. And again, it's finding the right voices and having the right panelists is really important. I always want to try to give people very pragmatic tools. And if you're trying to create a luxury experience, for example, I would say to them, narrative is really the most important thing that you can do. If you can create a story that creates an experience for the guest, they will remember it, and that will touch them on some level, hopefully emotionally. They'll have some kind of memory response, and then they will post about you, and they'll tell friends about you, and they'll do what we want them to do, which is to help expand that brand. And I think it comes down to some essential tools, and communication is really important to everything in the world, every type of business. But in design, I think it's critical. The space has to communicate its purpose and what it's about, and it has to have a point of view, and it has to be easy to experience and to navigate through, and all of those things are really important.
Do you prefer being a moderator or panelist?
I prefer being the moderator, and it sounds like I'm a control freak. I know, but the reason I like being the moderator is I'm so careful about the people I select to be on the panel, and I know them. I've never had anyone on the panel that I didn't know. It's always someone that I've researched, I know them, I've heard them speak, and I know what they're going to bring to the conversation. And I've had some powerhouse panels, I mean, just incredible people. And I'm like, okay, they're all smarter than I am, but I'm really good at guiding them through this process and structuring the questions in a way that really engages them with the audience. And all the timekeeping and not letting one person monopolize and really keeping the narrative going and driving the story where I had planned, but with their experiences and their expertise. It's exciting to me. It's really like for me, it's like being a film director. I feel like, okay, I've got Meryl Streep, and I've got all these great actors here, and all I have to do is direct them well, and this is going to be a masterpiece. And fortunately, it's worked out that way most of the time. I can't think of a really bad experience I've had. So I like playing that role. I certainly love sitting on panels, but you don't have much control when you're sitting on the panel. It's the moderator is the one who's really driving the film.
Do you have any tips for young designers who are looking to participate more on conferences and potentially be on panels?
Yeah, I do. And I always say to them, do your homework first. Read all of the trade publications, really know what editors are talking about, what they're interested in. What are the narratives within our industry? We've had all these catchphrases in the past few years, experiential design. We've talked a lot about being local and authentic. We've talked about luxury. So there are these topics that people are interested in. And then, is there a unique angle? Is there a perspective that someone else hasn't thought about? I always try to bring something original to it. I had put together a panel for BD&Y, the one that's not happening, and it was really interesting to me because I was reaching out to people who came to design from different industries. So they came maybe from filmmaking, or maybe one of them was a theatrical set designer. They came in with different skills, creative skills from different industries. And I thought it was very interesting to see how they adapted that and brought it into the sphere of interior design. And, I definitely will do that panel. So look for that in the future because I think no one's done that. And I think that would be interesting to hear those very different voices. I did a little bit of that when I did the luxury panel because I had a lighting designer and I had someone from Baccarat, and I sort of changed it up and had different segments of the industry. One person came out of food and beverage. She was with Two Roads Hospitality, and so their voices were different. And for me, a good panel is one where no one replicates the other person. They're not all saying the same thing in different words.
Right.
They're actually they have different points of view based on their skills and their role within the industry. And I find that fascinating myself.
When is a young designer ready for that panel, right? I mean, they have to build some sort of a confidence for that, maybe potentially get over impostor syndrome. How do you help them kind of overcome that and just get them on stage and perform?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've had a couple of younger designers that I have helped to get to that point, and they're very nervous about it. Speaking on stage is, for many people, one of the biggest fears. They once did a study, and the fear of public speaking was second only to death. And
Right.
for me,
Yeah.
I don't get that. And you're obviously very comfortable on stage as well. I love it. To me, it feels very organic and very natural. I don't feel my pulse doesn't quicken. I feel excitement, but I don't feel that. But I can empathize with people that do, and so I've helped some younger people do that. And I always say to them, you will know more about the story that you're telling than anyone else in the audience because you're crafting it. So you're in this position of power because you're putting this together and you're creating it, and you know what you want to say, and that gives you a certain level of authority. You do have to do your research and your work, but I always will review it with them. I have a lot of younger designers who will say, "Can I send you something that I'm writing or something?" And I'm like always glad to read it and give them my thoughts. I think you just have to do the research and do the work, but then you just have to be bold and step out there and do it. Just join the discourse. It's not going to be as disastrous as you think it's going to be. You may not be fabulous the first time you do it, but the second time you do it, you'll be a little better. The third time, and it's a building process. So I think they need a little bit of time under their belt. I wouldn't do it, straight out of school unless it's some special panel that is, looking at the perspective of designers that are just starting out. But get a little bit of experience under your belt, do your research, get someone to mentor you, and then go for it.
I want to go back to diversifying revenue streams. When do you know when you're spreading yourself too thin? Have you run into this problem before? If so, what did you do to find your footing again?
Yes, well, I did have a problem for a long time, and that problem was I did not know the word no, and I had to learn it because I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. Lots of times opportunities flow your way that are probably not really ideal for you, and if you get sort of caught up in the ego of it, you're like, oh, I'm getting an offer to do this, so yeah, let me go and do that. And what you can do really is sabotage yourself because you're spending so much time on those things that you're neglecting the core of your business. And so what I started doing that helped me, I've mentioned spreadsheets a couple of times. For me, when I got something down on paper, it helps me to focus and to start figuring out a way to be successful with whatever I'm trying to do. So as I get media requests, or, I'm doing an article now for Inspire Design Magazine, one of their mood boards. So, I get that deadline onto my spreadsheet, and I talk about what the content is, and I look at that on a regular basis. I'm like, okay, what do I have coming up for the next 2 weeks? And if I've got a deadline that's on Tuesday, I'm thinking to myself, oh, Mondays are never good. So
Right.
I'm going to carve out some time on Saturday afternoon. It's not the end of the world to spend some time working on the weekend. And, many of us work from home now, so you can just go in, after a walk or after going to the gym or whatever, just go in and spend an hour. You'll be surprised what you can get done. So I just am strategic about it. And now, I do turn things away because I just think, well, it's not really going to directly benefit the projects I'm working on now. It's not critical to my firm. I'm really pretty tight on deadlines already. So I've learned how to gracefully say no to someone and say, I can't really fit it in now. I'd love to do something with you in the future, but at the moment I'm really overbooked. So I've started being honest about that and transparent, and not pretending that I can be a Superman and do everything. I go through little stages where I will do that. I'll give you one quick example. When I go to High Point Market, I work 12 to 14 hours a day. And I do that for an entire week. And I can do that, for a shorter duration of time. I can just be that, Superman who's go, go, go on camera, on stage, interacting with people, and it's very exciting in some ways. And then, you have that crash at the end, when you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. And my brain is just absolutely drained. But, I think as long as you don't extend that for too long, you can't sustain that. No one can sustain that for months at a time because they'll burn out. And burnout is a real thing. I've seen it so many times with people in the industry who don't figure out how to find that balance. And as I've gotten a little bit older, I have really focused more on the work-life balance. And I'm actually doing much, much better with that. And I think COVID actually has been a good opportunity to reboot and reevaluate. And what I'm finding now is I put myself on the list when I'm structuring these schedules now. And, I don't miss going to the gym. I go and I do that, and I do my yoga, and I have at least a half an hour a day that I can play my piano. And so I schedule things into my day and into my life that give me the balance. So, if I come back into the office, my office is at home at the present time, like so many Americans, then, it's okay if I work for 2 or 3 hours because I've been to the gym today, and I've had a walk yesterday, and I've played the piano and I've cooked dinner, and so I've done those things that really keep you connected to your family, your spouse, and whatever kind of relationship you're in, and also interacting with your community. So all of those things are important, I think, and it's just finding finding the balance between those. So I try not to overextend now, but I still do a lot.
I just want to follow up on what you said about saying no. You work with a lot of young designers. When did you start saying no more in your career? Do you encourage young designers to say yes to a lot of things, and at some point they have to start saying no? Where's that balance, and when did that happen for you?
For me, it happened too late. I was one of those who was so driven, and I had lived in New York City, and one of my early steps in my career was I was with Macy's New York and went through their executive training program, and they taught an ethic of just work constantly and push constantly, and that sort of became ingrained in me. And then I went to grad school, and it was the same thing again. And I had a carrel in the library, and I would read for hours a day, and I would write, and I would be up till 2 a.m. writing, and then back, in class, in the morning. And, I could do that during those years. When I look back on that, I really feel like I probably should have had more fun in my life. I probably should have built in more balance then. I was so driven and so focused because, I had that goal in my sights, and I just refused to yield to anything but that. And so, I would do that differently now. I've had some young designers I've worked with, and I remember, excuse me, a very poignant event about a year ago. We were working on a hotel up in Pittsburgh, and this young designer had said yes to the other senior designers who would ask her to work on a project. And suddenly she was having a meltdown. We had just finished a meeting, and she was in tears, and I'm like, okay, what's wrong? Let's talk this through. And she had just overcommitted herself, and the people that she had said, yes, I'll help you with that, I'll do this, weren't aware of that. And so it really, to me, was a wake-up call. And I thought, we really need to think more carefully about what we're asking of each of the designers on the team, because I didn't want anyone to be in that position where they felt like they could not deliver, they couldn't be their best, they could not be successful because they had too many things. There's a point where no one can be successful with that. And so that was, for me, a great learning opportunity in terms of how to manage better. And then we didn't have that issue again with this particular designer, because we would check in and just say, okay, what are your obligations for this week? And I think that structure, that review structure, is really important.
How has the interior design space changed since the beginning of the pandemic? Anything in particular stand out to you?
Yes, there's been really fundamental changes, and I think we really haven't seen the end of it yet. It's going to be difficult to know just how big the impact is. One of the things, obviously, that I've noticed as someone who does both residential and hospitality, and for the past 15 years, have been really focused 90% of the time on hospitality. Well, hospitality obviously has gone through a tremendous downturn because of the pandemic. Travel and entertainment industries, and all of that really literally shut down with the pandemic. We had hotel projects. We were very, very busy, and then suddenly things were going on hold. This project's going on hold, that project's going on hold. And you suddenly have such a tremendous change very quickly. So it was hard for many design firms to respond to that. And design firms that were not diversified suffered more, of course. I was with Baskerville at the time the pandemic hit, and we had different divisions. And that helped. So healthcare was still holding its own, and corporate was doing better. Hospitality took the hardest hit. But when you're diversified, it helps. Again, you don't have all your eggs in one basket. And so that's been one of the changes. Residential is soaring, and home is the center of the universe, and people are spending on renovations. Some of my friends whose practices are essentially focused on higher end residential, they really can't keep up with the pace now. And so that's been an interesting thing to see. A few years ago, I had lots of residential friends all across the country, LA, New York, wherever. And they were like, how can we get some boutique work? We'd really like to do some hospitality. How do you bridge that gap? And so, I spent a lot of time talking with them about that and telling them how I had done it. And, now it's like I want to reach out to them and say, how can I get some residential projects?
Right. Yeah.
So it's been a bit of an interesting thing there. The other thing that's obviously, and then there are little micro trends like home office. All the products related to home office are very very much coveted now, and I think there's probably an opportunity in the marketplace for someone to have some kind of online retail that focuses on that. I can't think of a good one at the moment. But I noticed at High Point Market, which occurred a couple of weeks ago down in High Point, I was one of the few people that went. It was not a huge audience, but it was a very, very good market because there was such tons of new product. And Bernhardt had an entire suite, several pieces of their showroom. It's an 80,000 square foot showroom, so it's an enormous showroom. They had 3 spaces that were devoted to home office. So they'd never had that before. That was a new thing. And then sectionals, every showroom I went into, I would talk to the presidents of the company, and we would have great conversations. And I said, what's been your item that has spiked? And they said, sectionals. Everyone is redoing their family rooms. They've got, their children are home. Their teenagers haven't been able to go out. They're all lounging around together, watching movies and everything. And so everyone's been getting these comfortable, lounge pads for that. So, things like that. I heard an interesting presentation, again, about a month ago, the Future of Home conference in New York, but it was virtual, of course. And Andrew Dent is a doctor, has a PhD in material science. And he talked a lot about how we are going to see certain materials surge. And he talked about finishes that are anti-pathogen. So they're both antimicrobial and antiviral. There are many surfaces that are antimicrobial, but they're not antiviral. And now that we've all gone through COVID and are still going through COVID, we are, I think, more attuned to the environment around us and how dangerous it can be. And we all understand microbiology better than we did before. And so that was interesting. So copper, we're going to see a lot of copper, zinc. Those 2 materials are innately antiviral. Viruses cannot live on the surfaces for any length of time. Whereas we know with glass and certain types of plastic, it can live for many hours. And so it can be passed from one person to the other. So I think we're going to see science and technology working with designers, and going forward, I think we will see that will be engineered into the products. We already have antimicrobial carpet weaves and antimicrobial fabric weaves, but that may even be, I think, amplified more. So I think there's just so many changes probably coming that we can't. That we don't have yet, as a response to that lesson that we've all had from the pandemic.
Gary, I know our time is almost up here, but I wanted to just kind of go back to that and talk about the trends. How do you, as a designer, assess if a trend is going to be short-lived? Right, we're all in the middle of a pandemic right now. We obviously don't know how much longer this is going to go on. But how do you avoid getting into something that may be something that's really short-lived and ends up not being really worth your time in the end?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do a lot of actually trend forecasting. I just did a lecture a couple of weeks ago for SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design, and putting that together and really looking at all kinds of resources, the virtual events that occurred this year. Normally I would be looking at the European shows and all of that. But they didn't occur. Really, essentially, the industry was shut down in terms of in-person presentations, but a lot of them moved forward virtually. So it's very interesting to do a trend forecast in this environment. It becomes tricky. What I look for is I look for things that are not simply something I'm seeing right now, but I've been noticing it sort of creeping into the design vocabulary over the last season or two. And I can see that it's getting velocity. And so an example of that is mid-century came along, and then mid-century kept arcing and arcing higher and higher and higher and higher. And now it's on the downside of the bell curve. And what I'm noticing for the past 3 seasons really, is Art Deco is starting to rise. Well, this market at High Point, when I had a chance to see, dozens and dozens of very large showrooms and enormous collections, I saw a lot more Art Deco inspiration. So if you envision that as two bell curves, the mid-century did its thing and now it's starting to decline and Art Deco is rising. So if I were advising a company that's producing products, or I were designing a hotel that's not going to be completed for 12 to 18 months, I would not be looking at mid-century for that. I would be looking for something that's got more of the sort of glamour and silhouettes of Art Deco. And then I would be looking at the color stories, which are always an important part of what we spec out as interior designers. So that's the way you can avoid those shortfalls where you've invested a tremendous amount to have a hotel unveiled, and it's a design or a style that is on the downswing. So, which isn't what you obviously want to avoid, because then it doesn't feel fresh or relevant, and you want it to be a little bit at the front, near the front of the trend curve, because I think the deco curve is likely to last for 3 to 5 years before we start to see any decline in that, because it's such a deep archive. There's so many things you can do with it. And I really, as I'm playing it through in my head again, I saw so much Art Deco at market with many different manufacturers. So it's a broad, it's what I call a macro trend instead of a micro trend. So I think, that's going to be with us for a while. And then there are those things that are micro trends. And I saw a lot of curvaceous forms, upholstery that's not rectilinear, but very curvaceous. I don't know if that's got a long life cycle. Sometimes you have to do your very best guess. I love those forms, but I don't know if that one's going to have, the lifespan that something like mid-century had. So,
what are your plans for 2021?
So 2021, I'm really hoping to kind of get back on part of the track that I was on when COVID happened. So obviously I want to grow my practice and really want to do, homes and boutique hotels. I created a creative pairing with a designer I had worked with for 5 years. And she and I are going after things in the marketplace here in Richmond. And doing projects together. It's not a formal partnership in the traditional sense, but it's more of a kind of collaborative alliance. And so I'm in the process of forming one of those with a designer I've known for many years in Charlotte and sharing studio space there, so that I can tap into that market as well. I think that's a smart way to sort of move forward for practices, for smaller practices. I'm obviously interested in doing some more design collections, and I am talking with manufacturers about that. That's been one of the best things in my life, doing furniture design, fabric design, and so forth for manufacturers. I've been working on a book, and so I think in 2021, I'll have the basic outline of that book and most of the text written. So I'm hoping that 2021 is a really productive year in that regard. And, as I mentioned, I'm hoping to also start teaching in 2021, so that becomes an important part of my practice. So really all those things that I mentioned at the beginning that were going to be my 2020 is my big year. I'm really hoping I can achieve some of those in 2021, but I know some of them will probably move into 2022 when we're fully recovered from the pandemic.
What's the book about?
The book is called The Art of the Mix, and it is about a design philosophy that I share with many of my colleagues that essentially says a monotonous, one-dimensional design is not interesting, such as a room that's only mid-century. What really makes a room interesting and gives it that sort of dynamic quality is when you mix things like antiques, artisan-made products, maker goods, production goods. It's really got to be this kind of conflation of things that have character and have story and personality, and then the space comes to life, and each of those pieces adds to that dynamic. So it's really an argument for that approach to design rather than it's sort of the monolithic, almost like it feels most like a showroom than an interior space. And I see that oftentimes, and I always think, gosh, maybe it's attractive, but it doesn't really have any life beyond just that initial, oh, it's attractive. You don't get involved with that kind of space. And I like spaces. When I go into a space, I want it to do things to me. I want it to make me think and make me reflect. And so, that's the kind of design I'm trying to create. And I discovered, CJ, that I had a lot of colleagues, some of my very famous colleagues, who really felt the same way. And they said, oh, I'd love to be in the book. So it's going to be a book that's a collaborative effort. I'll be writing it, but it will be a collaborative effort in terms of the visuals. And I'll be interviewing these other designers. And so it'll be kind of all of our voices sort of speaking to this process of how you create an ideal room. And fortunately, we all overlap a bit. We all have, obviously, nuances, but I was delighted to discover I was not the only person who felt that way.
Gary, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.